Hello, welcome again to evidence. Now we are through with Rule 128, Rule 129, and Rule 130. So now let us proceed to Rule 131 on burden of proof, burden of evidence, and presumptions. So now let's start with Section 1 on burden of proof and burden of evidence. So this section provides us what is the concept of the burden of proof and burden of evidence. So the burden of proof is the duty of a party to present evidence on the facts in issue necessary to establish his or her claim or defense by the amount of evidence required by law. Now the burden of proof never shifts. So basically, this burden of proof, as a general rule, lies with the party who alleges the existence of a fact or a thing necessary in the prosecution or defense of an action. So kung sino man yung may ina-allege na affirmative fact, okay, something affirmative, like for the prosecution is saying that the accused or the suspect is the one who sold the drugs or who stole a particular thing or who killed the victim. So that's an affirmative fact, in which case the prosecution has the burden of proof. So now, there are certain ways to determine which or to which party rests the burden of proof. Kung sino man yung ang may burden of proof in a particular case. But let's focus ourselves on criminal cases. And usually, in criminal cases, it is usually always the prosecution which has the burden of proof. Okay, the prosecution has the burden of proving that the accused in a criminal case has committed the crime. Okay, so remember, this burden of proof is always on the prosecution. It never shifts from to the accused or the defense as a general rule. Of course, there's always an exception. Like for instance, if the accused in a murder case pleads, okay, that admits on killing the victim, but invokes a defense, like say for example self-defense. He killed the victim because of self-defense. So in that case, the burden of proof now is with the accused. So because the accused is alleging an affirmative defense, an affirmative thing, then he will have the burden of proving that the killing was through a self-defense. Now, okay, but remember, once the burden of proof is determined to which once the burden of proof is determined to which party it rests, then that burden of proof never shifts. It doesn't shift from, for example, the prosecution to the defense, or vice versa, from the defense to the accused. It stays from where it initially rests. Okay, the burden of proof stays in the entire case to where it initially rests. If it initially rests on the prosecution, then it stays there for the whole proceeding of the case. Okay, now let us discuss this burden of evidence. Now, the burden of evidence is the duty of a party to present evidence sufficient to establish or rebut a fact in issue to establish a prima facie case. The burden of evidence may shift from one party to the other in the course of the proceedings depending on the exigencies of the case. So, as the definition says, it is to establish or rebut a prima facie case. Okay? So, for instance, in a criminal case, for whoever whoever has the burden of proof initially has the burden of evidence also at the start of the proceeding. So for instance, the prosecution has the burden of proof, then initially the prosecution will have now the burden of evidence. Okay, it will now have the duty to present evidence sufficient to establish a prima facie case. So ngayon, yung prosecution will now do its best legally to present evidence in the quantum of proof required, proof beyond reasonable doubt, that the accused will or has committed a crime. Okay, the prosecution will present evidence. Now, in that case, if the prosecution has established a prima facie case against the accused, then after it rests, after the prosecution presented its evidence, and thereby there being a prima facie case against the accused, now it will be the burden of evidence will now shift to the accused. The accused will now present evidence to destroy or to rebut the prima facie case established by the prosecution. Okay, so it's the burden of evidence which shifts from either party depending on the exigencies of the case. Okay, so that's the concept of the burden of proof and burden of evidence.